How to launch a podcast. That's actually all the things I did whenever I launched one of my podcasts, and all the things you also should consider when having your own podcast set up. So now let's first think about psychology for one moment. The thing is, you want to start a podcast and now you have a momentum going on. This means you have still the motivation. But of course, things eventually will get hard, and therefore you will struggle to maybe stick through with all the things connected to a podcast. And now the thing is, the more you strategize in the beginning, of course, the easier it will be down the way, but also the more complicated the next actions you will take will be, the less likely it will actually be that you will stick through with actually making the podcast a real thing instead of an idea you once had and never really fully implemented. So now, the first thing I would consider is to go on to a platform that is very easy. A platform that basically distributes your podcast for free and also hosts it completely for free. So this is essentially what YouTube is doing. So when it comes to releasing something online, there are actually two sides that are very important, or two things that are very important. The first thing is hosting the content. This means somebody has to have like a computer that is connected to the internet and that has the files stored onto this computer, and basically providing the files to everyone that actually wants to watch this video. This is called the host. And in the past, podcast was a disconnected thing, because on the one side you had the host and on the other side you had the distribution. When it comes to video, we know all these platforms and we know them as combined platforms. YouTube is a combined hosting and distribution platform. So this means YouTube is actually storing the files, but it also is distributing the files. Of course, there is no bigger distribution platform like in music, for example. You could go to one label. The one label would be like, oh yeah, I go to Warner Music, I go to Sony Music, and I would just do everything for you and just distribute your music to all these different agencies that actually then release your music again onto Spotify, onto iTunes and stuff like this. But when it comes to podcast, it used to be a little bit different. It used to be that there was the host on the one side and the distribution on the other side. And the distribution is basically all the platforms you know through listening to podcasts. It's Spotify, it's Stitcher, it's maybe your local podcast app on your Android device. It may also be Google Podcast. This is actually the distribution side of podcasts. So now the first thing is you should just go onto Anchor, because Anchor is basically the YouTube of podcast, and Anchor was and still is one of the first platforms that actually allows you to host your files for free. Because in the past, for example, when I started my first podcast in 2018, actually Anchor didn't exist yet, and there existed something else, but it was called Castbox, a similar concept. But the thing is that Castbox, it was, I tried it, but Anchor, it just wasn't Castbox. It was basically a closed system. It wasn't not an open system. Castbox only distributed it to Castbox itself. It's nice. Castbox was a nice host, and basically it also had this own network, this own Castbox network. But the now very cool thing about Anchor is this. Basically takes all the distribution work off of you. The only thing you have to do is upload your files. It could also be a video file, and Anchor just scraps the audio off of the video file, and then you click one button and it's like, okay, and we now give the files to Spotify, to iTunes, to Stitcher, to basically every major platform out there. This is huge, because in the past, for example, when we did our first podcast, we tried to launch it on Castbox, because this was like the only, or one of the only free podcast hosts out there. And the problem was that then I had to go into all these different directories. I had to register an iTunes account, and then I was like, yeah, how about I give you this podcast ID, not ID, but this podcast RSS. But this is all something you don't have to worry about when you just go onto Anchor. But now I already said something called RSS. What is the RSS? Basically, the RSS is just a link. It's a link to the file. and said link to the audio file. So whenever you listen to podcasts, essentially what is going on behind the scenes is that you are saying, I want to listen to this file, and then this is going over the internet, and then until it reaches the file, and then the file is requested, and then it is provided to you via the internet. That's what's happening. And the link to this file is called, it's not the link to this file, it's more the link to your directory of files, which is called your podcast. So this is the RSS link. And the RSS feed is basically this. Whenever you upload a file to your podcast host, the podcast host is like, oh yeah, we have new files in the directory, and these new files are then, and this message is basically sent to everybody, to all the podcast directories, and then this is called the RSS feed, and therefore you now have all these people, and with notifications on their phones, for example, that they have that a new episode was released, and therefore it's kind of an updating process for the episodes. It's basically saying, oh, there are new files in this folder. So now, so much about hosting. So what you need to do is you just go onto Anchor. I mean, it's not that I'm not sponsored by Anchor or anything. It was the first tool, and I was like, I mean, with Castbox already, because it was free, because otherwise storing a normal podcast that's released like once a month would have cost me as a creator $10 a month, and that's not very cheap. If you think about your phone contract, that's probably also $10 or $20 a month. So having multiple podcasts, this would have been a nightmare. And if you think about YouTube, for example, if YouTube actually had similar costs, then for uploading one video like this one, I would have to pay $100 for the same amount of file storage. So much about the hosting side, so much about the backend side. So now let's go into actually all the other things are things you don't have to worry about anymore. And this is why I said this psychological thing in the beginning is so important, because the distribution part is now totally done by Anchor, and I wouldn't worry about it. Of course, it could happen that there are problems with it, but then you have Anchor. You can just go to Anchor and be like, hey, what about my podcast? So you have a partner in crime, and Anchor is the partner in crime. Anchor has also been bought by Spotify in the year 2019. So this means, unlike Castbox, which is like a smaller podcasting platform, it's pretty much backed by the biggest audio company in the world, or by one of the biggest. It's not the biggest audio company in the world. It's the most favorite, or it's the most popular music streaming service, which means they also have, they know a little bit about audio. This is something I guess you could say, or they know a thing about audio, or a thing or two about audio. So that's the right way of saying it. So now we have covered the site where you actually upload the files. It's like YouTube, it's called Anchor, and the actual URL is anchor. That's a good question. Just Google it. I actually do not really remember it. It's not anchor.com, but anchor.something different. Now, we covered this site. What you now need to do is you need to think about what this podcast actually should be. If you think about what a podcast actually is, it's mostly two people talking, or one person talking. So this could be a podcast because I'm talking. And another thing about podcasting is that it's not a visual medium. This means that if you are explaining something in math and you're using graphics all the time, or a graphic, or you draw things, then of course this doesn't work over podcast, because it's limited to the audio alone. And that's one limitation of podcast, of course, that it's limited to the audio alone. So it only kind of works for things that can be consumed by the audio alone and can be understood by the audio alone. This means, for example, would it make sense to convert all YouTube videos into podcasts? No, because many YouTube videos rely on the visual part. It would also not make sense to distribute a feature film via a podcast, because then you would only have the audio. Of course, it would make sense to distribute a audiobook via a podcast, because the podcasting system is just a way of distributing audio files. And so now, this is a big thing. Podcast is just a way of distributing audio files. And if you only have the audio file, then that's limiting the content into, or yeah, limiting the content. And this means now that the content needs to be without the need for having the actual visuals, because otherwise it doesn't really make sense. Of course, you can also use the distribution channel of podcasting, which is not identical to the podcast itself. So basically just this system of hosting something on something and then distributing it via the RSS to all the directories like Spotify, like Stitcher. And you can also use this to distribute videos, and this is also something that has already been done and is still being done. For example, TED, the company that records all these TED Talks. So basically someone holding a talk in front of an audience, and then they are distributing this thing. And often these are very famous people or people who want to be famous. So that was just a small side note, I guess. But now, the thing is, you could theoretically also distribute the video to the podcast, but many podcasting apps, for example, or many podcasting services don't even support video. Of course, you could still use this way, but I wouldn't, because it's not the standard way, and because it's essentially something that's doubling YouTube. That's basically, you would basically create an alternative to YouTube, to Facebook Watch, and also to other video platforms like Vimeo. But the thing is, of course, Instagram TV, Facebook Watch, and also YouTube are the three biggest video platforms out there right now. And this is the way you should and could kind of use them. Let's now think about something different. The next thing is how to actually record. And if you actually record, there are two ways this can go. You can either go audio alone, or you can actually try that the audio basically is only one part of something bigger, that the podcast is essentially just another offer for you, for the interested person that actually listens to you, to consume. So the thing you now need to figure out is this. When you start the podcast, of course, you could start the podcast and create 100 episodes, but I wouldn't just record 100 episodes. Of course, there is something to be said about just recording, and this is actually really important, because when trying to figure out all this podcasting thing in the beginning, the thing you actually do the least is the actual recording itself, but that's the thing that you will do in the future, and that's the thing that's actually probably the most fun about podcasting. Of course, it can also be not so much fun if your level of quality, for example, or if your standards for quality are higher than what you actually can deliver, but it's just another thing you actually have to consider. You have this grand idea, and how it actually will turn out will be like this thing, but a lot shittier. And this is what you kind of have to accept, because you only get better if you stick to it and actually improve when talking to people, for example, like I do right now. So therefore, long-form videos or podcasting are already something to consider when trying to train you actually talking to the camera or talking to people. For example, I, for the most part, looked right to myself, which is because I'm recording on my phone, and actually talking to the camera is a different experience, because people actually realize and see if you look straight into the camera. The thing is just that I have like an image of myself, because I cannot darken the image. I could actually try to use something and actually look at you for the rest of this video, which I will just do right now. And I just use a mask in front of this. Does this work? I think so. So this is of course an inconvenience for you. And I am still there, which is kind of sad, but at the same time I would just now try to continue. So now the next thing you want to consider, and the thing I'm still trying to explain, is this. Do you actually want to only have a podcast as an audio, or do you also want to have your podcast on YouTube? So now it doesn't really make sense to have an audio only podcast and then to try to put it on YouTube. There are a lot of companies out there who then add something to your audio, like waves, for example, the actual audio waves that move in a certain way. And of course, there are also a few people that listen to podcasts, so to audio-only podcasts with a little bit of video on YouTube. Of course, there are people out there, but it's not like what YouTube optimizes for, because YouTube actually relies on people creating videos that are visually also interesting, on not only the audio. Because the thing is, YouTube is a video platform. Therefore, if you listen to a podcast on YouTube, of course, you can do it. But it's like, okay, what is the best? YouTube is like, okay, what is the best way to watch videos? And how can we make the most money with people are watching the videos other people provide? But this is the thinking of YouTube, but the thinking of someone who creates a podcast app, for example, is this: what is the best way to listen to podcasts? And therefore it makes sense, because there is a different thinking behind it. And it's just that podcast is not really meant for YouTube as audio alone. But now there's a different approach, actually just creating a video that is not very visually heavy like this one. Of course, you could listen only. So, of course, you could watch. No, what I'm trying to say is this. Of course, you could. Okay, this sentence doesn't make any sense. So there are two ways, of course, you can watch this video. And the one way is you listen to the audio alone and you just listen to my voice. And the other way is you actually watch the video, and therefore it's a different experience, I guess, because you have also me waving my hands in front of you. And you also have my image, and therefore you may receive the information differently than just having my voice. For example, a comment I got actually on one of my platforms or one of my channels is that that people thought, so there was this one dude and he thought I was an Indian old guy who spoke pretty decent English. So that's of course funny, but it already gives you an impression of, if you just listen to the voice and then you have an image of this person, I mean, this can be a totally different experience. But what you can do if you record video like this is, of course, that you can just take the video, and this is actually something you can do. You can record a video and then you just upload the video itself. You don't even have to go like, okay, and now let's import this into Adobe Premiere and try to output the audio file alone. You don't even have to create an audio file. All you need to do is create this one video file. And this is what I am doing for my own system of content creation. I just create video files, and it's the same I do also with music, basically. It makes sense to not only think about a podcast as something that is audio only, but a podcast is basically just a format. And the format is that it's mainly things that can be consumed without the actual visual part of it, or can also be consumed without the visual part of it. It doesn't mean that it's the same experience. It just means it also could be an experience that's worth an experience, or that's worth listening or viewing or listening to. Now, the strategy I have implemented and the strategy I came up with is this. I, in general, try to, of course, not waste time doing these things, because wasting time is always something that just is a waste of time, and therefore there is basically, if you optimize something, then of course there shouldn't be waste, because waste is something negative already, something defined negative already. So I try to basically create these videos as efficient as I can and also as effective as I can. This means optimizing the process of actually recording and also distributing those videos, for example, but also the whole process, which is then called effective. Now, the thing is, storing all these different, so for example, if you recorded an audio file and then you have the audio file, but now you're like, well, I actually could put the podcast also onto YouTube, and then you have to go and, what can I put there? Maybe an image, or what if I wanted to only post a short clip onto Instagram of my podcast and it's audio only, then you all the time have to search for something. This means, of course, there's the big advantage that people just don't see you, and you actually can record a podcast you can record a podcast just sitting on your couch or your bed like this, and you don't have to have like a proper video setup. Of course, this is like much more work for creating a podcast alone. But the podcast alone is also just the podcast alone. And of course you can make a show big, but eventually every big podcast also you see nowadays is not audio alone, but eventually also will go into video. And here's why. Because video is just even more engaging. The thing is, of course, with audio you have much more time, because it doesn't have to be a primary thing you do. You can listen to audio and go on a ride with your bicycle. You can listen to audio whenever commuting to your work. You can listen to audio while washing the dishes. And that's already the biggest advantage of having a podcast as audio only, or having a podcast which also has the offer of audio only. It's the thing that people will just listen much more to you, because they can, because they don't have to sit there and watch something. We can only watch one video at a time, and this means the videos are usually shorter than podcasts. But now there's a different thing. What if there's a person that is just enjoying the evening and maybe listens to it, but also wants to tune in it? It's basically like a panel discussion in TV, or like this video. I mean, you could theoretically also only listen to this video, and this is what I will probably plan in the future. But it works also, of course, as a video, because I mean, it's a video, and therefore you could theoretically also watch this as a video. So the thing is, I wanted to have a medium format where I created like one piece of content and actually had content for as many platforms as possible, because then I could reach as much people as possible, as many people as possible. And here's what I came up with. This is not something you should now think about, but eventually this may be something you could think about, but not when starting a podcast. But just in order to give you perspective on what it actually also can be, I just give it to you now, or explain it to you now. The thing is, I first wanted to create blogs. But if I created a blog, and for example, I wanted to post something onto Instagram, I could just post a link, of course, but then I would need an image. If I now created a blog post, and I also wanted to share this blog post to YouTube, then what could I actually do to share this blog post to YouTube? I mean, it's only a blog post, therefore I actually had to sit down and explain it. But if I sit down and explain it, this is not the blog post anymore, because I will probably add something to it. I mean, I could just read it, but if I sit in front of you and just read from the screen, that's also not very engaging. So the thing I came up with is this. It's not the most optimal thing ever, but it's something that works as of right now. And it's this. You create basically one piece of content. This could be, the one piece of content usually has a title, and it's the same for a podcast. Every piece of content has a theme, and the theme is the title. I mean, it makes sense to title the episode or the medium you create, or the piece of media you create, as the title should be the thing that basically summarizes all of it. So for a podcasting episode, this could be how to launch a podcast, and this is actually the title I would probably put into this video, or put onto this video, or onto this podcast, if I eventually release it as podcast. So therefore, I came up with this concept of first writing a blog post, because then I had a blog post I could actually post. Then I would use, basically with every blog post, I had at least the title image. This title image would be something that I could post to Instagram, theoretically, if I wanted to share the blog post onto Instagram, which is something that is probably, I mean, it theoretically would work, but the thing is, it takes a lot of time to create this blog post and then share this link to all these blog posts with maybe a picture onto all these other platforms. Therefore, I would just stick to the platforms that are already built into the blogging itself. So there's a plugin called Chatpack, and this basically allows you on a WordPress page, which is the page I have, for example, when it comes to a blog post, that lets you share your blog post automatically. So the link to the blog post onto Facebook, onto LinkedIn theoretically also, but also only to your personal account, onto Twitter, and onto Tumblr. This basically means, if you think about Tumblr, for example, I mean, Tumblr is a really nice blogging platform, but what you actually want to create is a system where with every piece of content you create, you have to automatically create content, or at least a shareable link for all the other platforms as well. So this means, what if you created one piece of thing and then you actually could distribute it to as many platforms as possible? This meant, now we have the blog post. Now how could I create a video out of this? By recording the screen and recording my voice to it, and then I have a video. So this is something I did for all the scripted episodes, basically where I write something and then I actually say it, but I just read it instead of actually explaining also and talking basically free like this one. I don't have any script whatsoever. This is completely free, which is also something I couldn't do like a few years ago. I was like, but of course you have to train it. It's not only conversation, but it's also like conversation about one particular topic, and yeah, but it's so much about the training. And what you actually, this is also a very nice thing about podcasting. And this is something I already mentioned, but because podcasts tend to be accepted as a longer format, the thing is that you just can talk longer. The more you talk, the better you get at actually talking about the things you want to talk about in your podcast, for example. So now, also, this doesn't change anymore. This is weird, because usually it changes whenever. Yeah, well, just a side note. So we will stick with this color for a while. But how to launch a podcast, back to the basics. And back to my system of basically creating a unified medium that I also could host on as a podcast. So I had the scripted thing that I could post the video onto YouTube. I could also, at any point in time, take short snippets out of this big video and be like, okay, let's actually post this as a TikTok or a reel, basically a short video, 1 to 60 seconds, to a short video platform. Theoretically also to Twitter, but Twitter, of course, is also a mixture between many different things, and therefore I wouldn't use Twitter as a platform for short video. I mean, of course you theoretically could, and I actually don't know about the inner workings of Twitter that much, because I mainly use it just to share my automated links to the blog post, for example. So now you have the blog post, which is basically the script for the YouTube video. And the YouTube video could also be you explaining this, basically just reading the script, or also you could just have the script and then learn it and then just saying it. And you also could just use now the audio, for example, whenever, for example, it's not for example, but I have this script basically, and a blog post is nothing else than a script, because it's things you can explain, but it's like a very dense format compared to just talking. At least compared to just talking for most people that are talking. And now I have also the video. I can take short snippets out of this video. I can share the link to the video, and I also can share the link to the platform, to every platform I can share things to, or about, or use them as platforms in order to share, to just provide a link to something and not post it as a native content on this platform. For example, Twitter, for example, Tumblr, which you can also now use to just share the video or share the thing you posted on Instagram, would also be something you could use to promote your podcast, basically. And yeah, that's already it about the unified thing. You have basically, yeah, we of course are talking still about the podcast. This means now you would have a scripted podcast. If you write the script, post it, you basically post the script. But that's also, for example, many YouTubers do their scripts but don't publish them as posts because it's just too much backend work. Therefore, you need to make things easy, and therefore things like this unifying scheme actually make sense because they make things easy. But if you have podcast alone and you rely on podcast alone, then you're just not using all the possible attention you could get on all these other platforms, which is then, as a result, resulting in your podcast having less listens or less views. But for example, if you also had videos on YouTube, then you would just reach a different target audience that would also be interested in your content. Maybe not only because they are different people, that don't listen to podcasts, but maybe also because they just watch video, but they actually are interested in the same content, but just not in this format. They just don't listen to podcasts because that's nothing they have ever heard of. Like a 65-year-old grandma or a 75-year-old grandma is probably not that into podcasting as someone who is like younger. So now, this would be one concept for a podcast. You would have scripted episodes, then you would have as a blog post, because eventually if you go on Anchor, you already have your Anchor page, basically your podcast page. You already have a page and you don't really need to host your own page, but theoretically you could also make your own page, because let's face it, a podcast is not only a podcast. It's like with YouTube or like with Instagram. It's not only about YouTube, it's not only about Instagram. It's about the actual brand or the person behind it. It's about the actual concept, the idea behind it. And the actual concept or the idea behind it can be present on many multiple platforms, also in different media formats, as a short video, as a long video, as audio only. And this is the way to think about also podcast. Podcast is just a format. And now when it comes to two people talking, for example, if you want to interview people, it's you and the interviewee, then you can do the same thing. You just have to create a video file that's appealing. Of course, it's already more complicated, I guess, because this is also the reason I currently do most of these things alone, because then I'm not dependent on many other people. For example, if you wanted to call somebody for your podcast and actually record the audio call, then this is like a very huge backend already, because you have to think about how you record the audio, because if you just record the phone call, then you have like very crappy audio. But now, if you said that you only recorded videos where you and the other person are present at the same time, of course, there's a limitation. But this also means you basically cut at least 20 to 30% of the backend, I would say. Because otherwise, you would have to edit all these things. And then you don't spend time recording podcasts or talking to people while recording, but you spend a lot of time editing. And editing is takes at least as long as the podcast itself, as recording the podcast itself. I would say it takes even more time. For example, I created a podcast, kind of a podcast, not really a podcast, but like an audio, like a radio episode, like a radio show, a small radio show for a friend for a birthday. And we were like two people talking, like radio hosts. And then I sat down and for 3 days straight, this was in my teenage years, I just edited out all the M's. Of course, I learned a lot about it, a lot about audio editing and stuff like this, but also it was just completely wasted time, because first of all, it doesn't train the right skill, because you as a creator, you just have to be better at creating and not at editing after, because that's something you cannot really improve on scale. But the better you are as a person, as a speaker, the more and the faster you can actually record these videos or this podcast you are doing. And if you spend all your time in the editing room, then that's what you're training. Then you are becoming a very good editor, but probably not a very good creator, because you are limiting everything by the editing, by the time it takes for you to edit it, because every video then has the whole backend of editing attached to it. So now, back to the podcast. I already led you from, okay, I want to start an audio podcast alone, to maybe thinking about it bigger, thinking about it not only bigger, but differently. Podcast is just a format, and therefore, most of the time, we think of the podcast format as two people interviewing each other or more people speaking. And you can do this format on many platforms, and it doesn't have to be audio only. So therefore, what I would say is, this system, with this unified system of media production I use with the blog post as a script, this only works for scripted content. But if you don't want to have like scripted content, so the idea kind of was also behind this, that I would eventually like make videos where I would also add animations. And for example, if I then already had the screen recording and the audio of me reading it, then everything I would need to do in the future was basically, I already had the script. And I also already had recorded the script, because I recorded it for YouTube, but also for the podcast, and then everything I would do, I mean, I still had the one piece of content, but if I wanted to make this into a much nicer video, then I would just add drawings to it, and I could use the same audio and only had to do the drawing, and then I could use the audio file or the video file and just lay the other file on top of it. And therefore I could like also do explainer videos where I just explain the thing I wrote about, and I wouldn't have to do anything but do the graphics, and I wouldn't have to record everything again. Therefore, it's also kind of a future-proof concept. But now back to podcast as an interview format. And what I would now recommend, and also this video is already hitting 35 minutes, and I don't want to talk until the next week to you. So therefore, what I would recommend is this. If it is possible for you to also record video, I would urge you to do so, because then you just can reach probably factor 3, maybe factor 4, maybe factor 5 times the people you would if you created a podcast alone. Because let's face it, either the content has to be very good, or your voice, or your manner of speaking, or your personality, of course, also. But it's implied kind of in the content. So either the audio alone has to be very good, but of course that's not really how it works. The audio is only like a limiting factor, and once it's good enough, it doesn't keep people from subscribing, basically. But if the audio is bad, then that's a knockout for many people, probably. And it's of course also the other way around, but you have to have a decent understanding of audio. Not really have a decent understanding of audio, but just a little bit of understanding about microphones. For example, this one is a very nice microphone, and you probably, at least to some extent, enjoy listening to me. And this is of course because of my voice, but it's also because of the recording. If I sat like 5 meters behind myself and actually tried to use the microphone in the same position, then this would probably not the best idea. Would be not the best idea. So now we talked about the distribution side. We talked about the concept of the podcast and how the concept influences also the distribution and your audience later on. We talked about the interviewing part, so this is also the concept, and that's probably already everything we talked about till now, a little bit also about the microphone. So now let's actually move into how to record the podcast itself. The thing is, I had a camera for very many years, and I tried to record video on it. And now the thing is, if you record a podcast and you want to add a little bit of video to it, then of course the problem is how to synchronize the audio to the video, or how to record basically in device the good audio from the microphone into the camera you have. And now what I would recommend you to do is not to buy a fancy camera, but to first of all invest into a very good phone with USB-C. What this allows you to do is to connect something like the Zoom, so basically a USB microphone, via a connection cable. So this is actually going out as a USB interface. And then what I have is a connection from USB-A to USB-C cable, and this goes straight into my phone. This means that I now have the audio directly onto this. This means that I only have one single file, and that's huge because it saves you so much time and so much backend. So the actual file management is, or the editing afterwards, you could potentially do is one thing, or trying to apply filters to a video, for example, instead of doing everything like while recording it. Like, for example, this is already like a video filter. I could change to blue, I could change to another color, and I already have this basically while recording. And this basically means that I completely cut out the process of editing afterwards. But now, a huge part of the editing afterwards when recording video is also synchronizing, or at least basically putting together the audio and the video, because very often these cameras only have like very crappy microphones, and then you record the audio externally on a device, and then you have like the WAV file, so there's a professional audio file or the MP3 file, and then you have to put it together with the video, and then you actually have to synchronize it, and there are different ways, and this takes a lot of time, and therefore it's just not something you should do. What you should do instead is not get a very fancy camera, but just get a very good phone. This also means you have a very big screen where you can watch yourself when recording yourself. But this is not only, most cameras don't have a screen where you can watch yourself while you record yourself. And this is, in terms of quality, very huge in terms of quality control, because whatever happens, I see it. Of course, this is also another thing when it comes to quality control. This is also why many podcasters listen to themselves all the time. It's just having your audio basically within your ear all the time, and therefore you just hear yourself all the time. Also, this creates like a different atmosphere from the normal atmosphere, because you actually listen to yourself all the time, and therefore also you just hear yourself louder, and this is actually quite a different experience. And it also kind of probably changes the way you speak, because you actually hear yourself like you for real do. Because this is a big thing about podcasting. You actually have to be comfortable, not only like if you record a video, of course, while recording video, you have to be comfortable at looking yourself on the video again and also posting it to the public, but you also have to be comfortable about your voice. And this is huge. Why is this huge? Because there's a difference in how we perceive our own voice, just like our own image, for example, because we only see ourselves when we look into a mirror, and therefore we see ourselves as a mirror image. But the people we interact with, of course, see the real image, and therefore it's already a kind of a different experience also when you see yourself on video. But the thing is, if you listen to yourself recorded, then normally what you listen to yourself is, or what you hear is your voice. But since your voice goes through your head, you hear it so basically the bones in your skull, they vibrate, and this means that the deep frequencies are a little bit louder. This means your voice actually sounds better if you listen to it in your head than if you record it. So this means that if you now want to have the same voice, you actually have to try to speak a little bit deeper, or to try basically to make up for the missing frequencies you usually would hear, because your whole skull basically vibrates, and this is the reason why your voice sounds crappy whenever you record it. So therefore, you could also try to train your voice. Of course, this is a very difficult topic, because also we see our voice as like this thing we connect to ourselves as a human being. It's the same with the image. We think of the voice as something we have, but in reality it's of course different. In reality, everybody has a certain vocal range, and the normal voice is just a habit we usually speak in. For example, I also could talk like this all the time, or I could also do different accents, but I wanted to say that's not the point, but that's not the point, I guess. The point is that you just have, these are just tools. And for example, if I put my thing, I don't know why I speak different if I put it on here, but you actually can change your voice. You actually should try to change your voice, because it's just an optimization process. If you try to optimize your voice, probably more people listen to it if you then compare to if you didn't try to optimize your voice. This means maybe speaking closer to the mic, but since this is like an open format video, I do not really speak very close to the mic. Of course, it's just louder, but it also just sounds different, because the closer you go to the mic, the more, so the louder part is one part. Why it sounds so much better, actually, if you compare songs and one is just mixed a little bit louder, people prefer the song that's mixed a little bit louder, because they think it just is better. But of course it's not. It doesn't even sound better. It's just louder. But actually another effect is whenever you go very close to the mic, then a very similar thing happens to the thing that happens in your skull. The actual deep frequencies, so the low frequencies, actually get recorded a little bit more than the other ones. Therefore, your voice just sounds better. And this is also the reason many of these podcasting hosts speak so close to the mic all the time, because that's when the voice sounds the best. And now if you move back a little bit, you have a lot more room tone in it. I also don't have a room that's very echoing a little bit, so therefore you wanna, in theory, have a room that has the least amount of room sound possible. So now we already covered like the theoretical part about recording your voice. The practical part is that you have to have a device that's recording the audio. And I and you theoretically could just use an audio recorder like this one. But the thing, of course, is I don't use this as an audio recorder because I embed the file already into the video. Of course, then the audio quality is not as good as it theoretically could be, but this also means that I, right now, for this video, for example, I don't have a 3 GB video file and another 3 GB of audio. And I also would have to match up the title and store it in the same folder. But all I create right now is I create one video file, and that's the actual file I upload. I don't have, like, if you edit a video, for example, you usually have all the files and then you cut out the end and the beginning, and then you have like different files. So now what do you do with the original files? This just creates files upon files upon files upon files. And this is just nothing you actually want to deal with. You just want to keep it as lean as humanly possible. This means for one episode, one file, and that's the one file you upload to Anchor, because you can upload video files to Anchor with the audio embedded into the video file itself. Then, I mean, yeah, that's just, I had just different thought, and this is also a thought I will explain to you then, but we were still talking about the lean process, and this is basically how the lean process works. I think I explained the most things. So the thing is, with modern smartphones, you can very decently record yourself. I record myself on the front camera of my Galaxy S10, and I use the Zoom H6 as an audio device to embed the audio into my phone. This also means I am independent of internet when recording, because I tried, for example, to record straight onto Anchor, which is possible on your phone app. I mean, this is a very easy way to start a podcast. Just download the Anchor app, record within the Anchor app, and then just upload the files. But this is not what I would recommend, because whenever you have a problem with your PC and you recorded 15 minutes of a podcast episode, then, well, you have a problem with your PC, and the recording is probably interrupted. And this also means you rely on internet for recording. This also means you have to connect all the things to your PC, which is also possible, but your PC doesn't have a very good camera. Then you have to get an external camera to connect it to your PC, and then where is the device where you actually store the file that has like all the information, that has like the audio information and the video information. This just creates dependency upon dependency upon dependency. So now, what I would recommend is getting a microphone that has like a built-in microphone like this one. So this actually is not only a recording device, but also it has these capsules, and these capsules also are recording stereo sound, which is also something that's very nice, because I can either go to the left ear or the right ear. I don't know if if it was the right way round, but I can only speak to your right ear or left ear right now. So if you do ASMR on your podcast, or if you have a voice that's very ASMR, then that's also something to consider. Because usually what happens is that you only have mono whenever you record something. So getting an actual audio recorder is kind of crucial, because it also makes your videos a lot better. I mean, this is only when you go into podcasting like on a professional level. If you only want to do a podcast for your friends or something, then probably the audio of your phone, because phone audio is getting better and better, is already enough, theoretically. But when you record video along with it, you actually have to have a distance to the mic, because otherwise you could just take your phone and go as close to the mic as possible. This would be the best way. But when recording video, of course, this is not something you can do, because then you are like close to the mic, close to the camera. Therefore, you have to have a distance. Therefore, an external microphone makes sense. So now let's talk about the components we actually have. I have an arm, which is basically the standard arm you get on Amazon, which is very cheap and also not very good, but it did its part, and it's an arm that can be moved. So this means you can also move the mic closer to your mouth, for example, then this here is a pop filter, which basically means that whenever I say things which have like these pop sounds, like pop, pop, then actually what happens is that the audio is too loud for the recording device. Then it clips. This is what the clipping is. And it makes this very strange sound. And a device like this basically blocks the air a little bit. At least it speeds down, or it stops the air, and therefore at these very fast speaking. So whenever you speak, you of course exhale air, and the air exhaled at these plop sounds is just very fast, and it just stops them or slows them down, and therefore they aren't as audible. How funny it is that there also is a company called Audible. So now I have this arm. I also have the USB going out of this. This is something I already explained. I have this filter, which also came with this arm. It was like $30 on Amazon for a Zoom H6 like this, which by the way, you could also connect like a guitar to it or anything else. So this is basically the only audio recorder I own, and I also record music for Spotify with it, either with the mic or also just use it as an interface to then again record it into my phone and also record myself playing the actual music, which then actually also gives me again only one file for Spotify, which basically is the podcast of music. Spotify is basically, if you think about it, it makes sense. You record like a music video where you actually play the music, and the audio is nothing different than music. And Spotify is basically, or all these music streaming services are basically, music is basically just a sub selection of audio, because audio can be everything. It could also be music. You could also make a music podcast where you only release music. Of course, that's not what most people use podcast for, but podcast is only a way of distributing mostly audio files. And I think you got it. And now, what do you really need to start? If you really want to start very lean, this means just getting a good phone, recording yourself in front of your camera without an external device. The next step I would recommend is getting a very good audio recorder. This, for example, was around $400, $350. It also came with 2 different capsules, and this improves your audio. This is also huge for video, because a video with audio attached to it that it's not good is basically a knockout, so people won't watch it. But if the audio is like 20% better, I don't know how much more people will watch the video, but audio, so there are some people that say, for example, for a movie or also for a video like this, audio makes up even 50% of the video, up to 50% or 40% or 60%. It depends on the source, I guess. But a good audio is just very crucial also for video, because I mean, there is not much happening in this video apart from my voice and my face changing and maybe my arms waving around in the air a little bit. So, of course, we only talked like about the things we can actually talk about and the things I don't actually have to show you. You have to go onto Anchor yourself. You have to create an Anchor account. You have to think about what the actual name of your podcast should be. Ideally, the name already would describe the concept. For example, a dude meets another dude could be a concept for a podcast, or I interview people could be a concept for a podcast. And of course, you have to find a name that's also very Google friendly. This means you can also search the name, and you also maybe want to find a name that has a domain which is not occupied but is free. This basically enables you to then build this podcast into a bigger thing, to maybe sell shirts of your podcast in the future, to maybe do live sessions on Clubhouse in the future, to maybe do videos on YouTube in the future that are not connected to the podcast itself. So a podcast is nothing different than a format, than basically a channel. And the channel is something that can be used not only for a podcast, but maybe also should be used for something else. And don't think about podcast as a podcast alone, but think about a podcast as just a channel, just like this one. And this is how to launch a podcast. By the way, this is the end